So here we go, we're at the TRT. So Nichol is going to share after the trauma, how to stand when you're just learning to stand again, which is an excerpt from Understanding Your Internal Constitution, the battle of knowing what you stand for, when you're just learning how to stand after trauma. So Nichol, we want to welcome you. You're on my screen over here, but Nichol, we want to welcome you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's exciting. So she's a Department of Defense SHARP instructor. So that's through the Army, which is really Sexual Harassment Assault Prevention Program instructor. And she's also part of, she also trains for SAPR teams, which is Sexual Assault Prevention and Response teams. And one of the things that I find fascinating about Nichol is that she kind of does double duty. We know that a lot of times, not always, sexual assault and domestic violence are tied. And she also is the helpline director for the Break the Silence Against Domestic Violence helpline. So I think that that's super cool that she's here to teach us and give us some training on trauma. Her contact information is nicole.borland84@gmail.com. I will share these links at the end of the training as well. So just to do some quick housekeeping, this is my information, Ana-Christina Hicks. You can reach me at toolsofhope.com. I'm going to do a super quick resilience jumpstart training. If you were here 2 weeks ago, you saw it, and it's 2 or 3 minutes. I always want to give you tools. And if you've seen it before, it's a reminder. If you haven't seen it before, it's a refresher, right? To just say, oh yeah, that's something I can add to my toolbox and refresh my toolbox, okay? And then we're going to have, oh, excuse me, I didn't change the name. We're having Nichol Borland. Nikki was 2 weeks ago. So Nichol Borland is going to be doing our training today. So housekeeping, it's about confidence and trust. Anything that's said, especially in the Q&A, it stays here, right? It's about honor, respect, and encouragement. Wanted to welcome Carrie. Carrie, I think you just jumped in. The class will be about 45 to 60 minutes, and the class will be recorded. I typically turn off the recording for the Q&As. And you can get some additional resources at resilienceresources.toolsofhope.com. It's going to look like this. You'll be able to jump into the YouTube channel, the Facebook group. The Facebook group is women. Sorry, guys. We're working on one that's for all victim advocates, men and women. But for right now, it's victim advocate and first responder women. And there is training available. I keep getting questions. Is there training available for your teams? Yes, I train first responder teams. I train military teams. So just get in touch with me, toolsofhope.com. Okay. So really quick, we're just going to do a quick resilience jump start. We're going to go over 3 resilience myths. Antonio, I think you saw this 2 weeks ago. So listen, the first myth is that resilience takes a lot of time. Sometimes we put off our own taking care of ourselves because it just seems like it's going to take so long and we don't know exactly where to go. Though the first myth is that resilience takes a lot of time. The truth is that steps to resilience can take seconds, literally seconds. And that's what the instant resets are about. That's the platform that I share, is the instant resets. So we want to understand that we can start to build resilience literally in seconds based on resilience hacks that are built into our bodies, okay? The second myth is that self-care and wellness are the same as resilience. I don't know how many times I've gone to national or state conferences and people talk to one-on-one in the hallway and they kind of roll their eyes regarding self-care. They roll their eyes with wellness. Sometimes the self-care and the wellness can be used as a weapon. I hear stories where somebody had a really tough call and went and needed to kind of vent and get a little bit of resourcing from a colleague or even from their supervisor. And the colleague or the supervisor used it as a weapon. Well, are you doing your self-care routine? Well, what does your wellness routine look like? So as Nichol said earlier, instead of using it to help people, they turned what could have been something that would have helped us into a trigger, right? Well, no, I just wanted to tell you that call was horrible. And now you're just smacking me with, is my self-care good enough? Okay. Self-care and wellness are not the same as resilience. Resilience is the actual tools that we use to get back up. Self-care and wellness are kind of preparation. The third myth is, Nichol, I'm going to mute you just for a second. So the third myth is that you can catch resilience with stereotypical cliches, okay? You tend to hear these cliches, okay? You don't catch resilience by simply telling somebody or telling yourself to just suck it up. right? Or if you're talking to, women, suck it up, buttercup, this kind of stupid cliche when somebody's down in the dirt and you're just like, suck it up. You know what? It happened a long time ago. Just forget about it. Just deal with it. Just move on, right? That kind of cliche. Or, you should be able to handle this. So you're thinking to yourself, I should be able to handle this. Just because you help other people doesn't mean that you don't need resources. So to say it in the positive, when you help other people, you also need resourcing yourself. Okay. So here we go. It's the idea of the art and the science. So here's kind of a cool tool that I put together a couple weeks ago. Is number one, it's the awareness. Hey, I'm tanking. Hey, I'm going down I'm spiraling downward. I'm having a really hard time. It might be one call, or it might be accumulation of a lot of calls, or it might be an accumulation of your personal life and your professional life kind of colliding. But it's the awareness of saying, I'm hurting right now, I need some resources. Number two, it's getting the reset. So the art, the awareness, and then getting the reset for yourself so that you can think more clearly, so that you can problem solve better, and so that you can feel better faster, and then be able to move into the decisions that you need to make. And T, the art, is awareness, reset, and then getting some traction. Using that reset to bounce off of so that you can start getting traction. And what I wanted to do is just put together a quick download that you can get right away. So it is case sensitive. I didn't put that on this slide. It's case sensitive. So it's bit.ly in small, lowercase, /67 quick resets, all capitals. Okay. Bit.ly /67 quick resets, all capitals. All right. So I want to bring Nichol back on, ask to unmute. Carrie, I'm going to mute you. Welcome. I think I muted the wrong person. We just had a little background noise going on there. So Nichol, welcome.
Thank you so much. I just have to say, I love the art thing that you did, because even when I look through the stuff that I've created in regards to talking about trauma, I'm thinking in my head as I'm going through my own stuff, I'm like, yep, that's an A, that's an R, that's a T. So you really can put anything that you've adapted to or learned about or put into play into that. So that's fantastic. I absolutely love it.
Yeah, that's cool. So tell us just a little bit about why you're here. I mean, you're here because I invited you, but tell us just a little bit of background on who you are, why you're here, and we're going to get a lot out of what you're teaching. So I'm excited that you're here.
Oh, hopefully, yay. I use a lot of humor just as a disclaimer. I find that it gets me further with interpersonal communication, but also it makes the setting more comfortable. So if I'm being humorous, it's not because the subject we're discussing should be treated lightly. It's just, it makes people feel comfortable. So that's kind of just my own disclaimer. As Ana-Christina said, my name's Nichol Borland. I am an installation trainer for SHARP. That would fall under the DoD, specifically the Army. The other branches still abide by SAPR, which is just a different logistics. And I also am the Helpline Director for Break the Silence Against Domestic Violence, both of which I work directly with victims of sexual assault as well as domestic violence. But what I really want to touch on and elaborate in this setting and in this safe space is the conversation that we're going to have is based on being a survivor, and understanding how you tick, what makes you react and act the way that you do, but also some tools for your toolkit in regards to doing this thing we call advocacy in the first responderhood in a healthy manner. So a lot of the conversations we'll have is not based on my positions. It's based more on being a survivor, what's worked for me, what's worked for others, and the work I do within my career field as well.
So yeah, I love it. So again, you're bringing two streams in. You're bringing the sexual assault, you're bringing and sexual harassment, which is also covered in SHARP, and the DV, and that idea of coming from a survivor standpoint also gives us a little bit different perspective. So we will be doing Q&A after. If you want to engage Q&A during, that's totally fine as well. But just for the participants to know, if they don't want to bring something up that's recorded, that I will be shutting off the recording. And as soon as you're complete, we share the links again to contact you, then we will shut off the recording and then do some Q&A. Okay. So I'm just going to let you jump in.
Awesome. All right. So the reason I found myself where I am today is, oddly enough, I was blessed at a very young age to know what I was going to do my whole life. Not many people get to say that. I was that weird kid that consistently was like, oh, you want the shirt off my back? Here you go. You can have it. I just always knew I was going to be a social worker. So my degree is in social work with a focus of sexual assault services. So I've been blessed to know where my path was going to take me at a very young age. I like to start with that. But it wasn't until 2016 that my own circumstances kind of slapped me right slap dab in the face when I started recognizing the vicarious trauma, but also the triggers that were coming off by doing what I knew I was born to do as an advocate. And the reason for that was I was in a domestic violence situation. And I'm going to talk a lot about internal constitution today. I wasn't having those questions with myself. So as the society we live in, we throw dirt on it. We suck it up, buttercup. I love that Anna said that. We pretend that everything's fine, unfortunately, until it's not. So it wasn't until all of my friend group kind of not so much cut me off in a negative manner. It was more so of you need to get out of this situation. But when I started feeling and understanding the triggers simply by doing what I was born to do, that was the reality check that I needed. So I did the work. 2021, here we are. Every day is a learning curveball and a learning process. But I really wanted to speak with everyone on this Zoom call about kind of what worked for me as a survivor, as well as having all the knowledge base, because I work with domestic violence and I work with sexual assault. But first and foremost, the question/comment that I pushed out to a lot of individuals that do what we do is understanding your internal constitution, what it says, and if it needs editing. Deep, right? And you can use it. I tell everybody that I give this brief to, you can use it because it really does speak volumes. So what I mean by that is we're all born into an environment and we have psychological things that will create us to be who we are. However, a lot of who we are is based on our community, the population we grew up in, cultural and ethical backgrounds. Did you come from a household where domestic violence was not there at all? Or did you come from a household where domestic violence was vibrant? All of these questions, right? So what are your biases? Why do you like the things you like? Why don't you like the things that you like? Who taught you to act and react the way that you do, right? So one of the largest things you can do, or you can disseminate to the survivors and victims that you work with, is understanding that internal constitution and if it needs editing. Now, one thing I never took the time to do is sit in the suck and sit in the silence and try to understand how I tick. Because again, we live in a society that pushes you forward. You pretend everything's fine. You pretend everything's perfect. You need to be a hard worker. You need to be a hard charger. We don't have time for feelings, especially as first responders and doing the things that we do, right? You don't have time for your own feelings. So I never allowed myself that process of sitting in the silence. And Ana-Christina and I were talking about it earlier. How many times in the Bible it talks about being still and Selah. It tells you so many times when you're going over scripture to sit in silence and be still so you can feel the words that are being disseminated to you. I think that just speaks so much volumes when we're talking about healing, spiritual or not, because you got to understand what your starting point is. If you don't know where your foundation is, you don't know where you're going to go with that, right? So why did I feel the way that I felt about females or domestic violence or male characteristics? I really had to take that time and figure out what my internal constitution said, where it came from, but also if it needed editing, which brings me kind of into the second part of that is you may have grown up in an environment that fumigated just world hypothesis and invulnerability theory. And what I mean by that is if you unfortunately find yourself being a victim of a crime and you embrace invulnerability theory, which is the thought process that if you do good, you're going to get good. You do bad, you're going to get bad, right? So you get what you get or you deserve what you get, and you get what I'm saying, right? So if you grew up knowing that that's truth, and then you've lived a life of good, I've done good, and still some type of crime was committed against you, that's going to throw you for a huge whirlwind, right? So what do you do with that at that point? You have to understand how you're ticking, why you're ticking the way you're ticking, and if you need to change that, right? So for folks that I work with, and then me, myself, that's a huge process in itself. So understanding your foundation and your internal constitution, why we feel the way that we feel, and where it came from. Lastly, doesn't need editing, which gets us into the second part of the conversation we're going to have is understanding you're going to have to be vulnerable, which is a hard word. It's even hard to say unless you've already done this work for quite some time. Brene Brown talks about vulnerability better than anybody I know. So a lot of my vulnerability talking points come from her books. So this is kind of just my, hey, if you haven't read her yet, you need to go read her. But you're not going to build who you are in your internal constitution without being vulnerable with yourself and being honest with yourself. Furthermore, you're not going to be able to build communication, or you're not going to be able to build connection with anybody external to you without that vulnerability, right? So there's a quote I like to use. I just used it last week with a youth group at my church. Is connection is impossible without vulnerability. Vulnerability is a promise you're going to get hurt, but that hurt that's handled with healthy coping mechanisms is where genuine growth lives. There's a lot of stuff right there, right? But first and foremost, after building that foundation, figuring out where you come from, what your internal constitution says, you have to sit in that suck and dwindle a little bit, because we are connecting creatures. We're social creatures, right? So you have to get right inside. If you don't do that first and foremost, nothing that you express outward is going to be handled in a healthy manner. So you do the work, now you're trying to do the work outward, right? It's important to be vulnerable because that's how you build connections. But in the same token and in the same breath, I'm telling you, you're going to get hurt. How many humans do you know that's like, I want to sign up for that hurt game? What's up? I can't wait. BRB. It's not going to happen. We don't like to be hurt. We like to live in our shield. We like to be protected from any broken attributes that could happen, especially after trauma, right? Most of the time when we're working with victims and survivors, including myself, because I'm speaking from a place of what worked for me, is that's how we get our power back. Building up that shield. I will trust who I trust on my own specific terms. That's how we gain our power back. We have to understand that that can turn from a healthy coping mechanism to an unhealthy coping mechanism really, really quickly, because you're not expressing and you're not allowing yourself to connect with other humans. But what you do with that connection is your power and your responsibility and what you have control over. A lot of times people will look at other people's reactions and actions towards them and say, see, this is why I don't be vulnerable. This is why I don't connect with other humans, because that person hurt me. That person broke into my house. That person, whatever the thing is. But we have to be able to go to bed at night and understand you did your part. You only have control over yourself. And to be able to build on your internal constitution and build those relationships back, you're going to have to be vulnerable with people. What they do with your vulnerability, that's their character. You let them go to bed and sleep at night with that. But you know you did the work, and you have to trust your gut and intuitions with that relationships that you're building. And the one thing with that, I like to say, my last kind of quote that I use is knowing that you have control over yourself. You did the hard thing. You did the work. You are building back that self-esteem, that self-confidence. I know who I am. I'm comfortable in my own skin. When you are hurt, because crazy lady here is telling you to put yourself in vulnerable situations, triggers are opportunities to use home court advantage. In using that home court advantage, healthy coping mechanisms are your weapon, right? So once you've done all the work, you have that steady foundation, you will be able to adapt from hurt, from trauma, and from triggers a little bit more fluently because you're using home court advantage. You're using your internal insides to say, I see this coming. This is not going to be good, but I can use healthy coping mechanism X, Y, and Z to overcome this. You're using your home court internal constitution, but home court advantage, and your weapons are those healthy coping mechanisms that you've adapted to because you know who you are. So long story short, all of the hard work really starts within you. But what do you do with that after you do all the hard work? For me, Google's life, y'all. Google's there. I use Google probably 46,000 times a day, right? So my coping mechanisms that I have found that work for me is meditation. It's huge because before doing the hard work, I drowned myself in work. I drowned myself in 4 different jobs. I'm guilty because I kind of still do that, so don't judge me. But it's because I want to help people. I would drown myself in busyness and pretending that I'm fine. So it took a long time to be able to sit in the suck and listen to my own insides on how I want to get better, how I can produce that, and then how I can put that in play. And I fortunately get that through meditation and sitting with the Word of God. Not everybody's spiritual, so I'm going to give you other ways that you can do that too. Books are amazing. Finding books, and not so much the self-help books, but books from humans that seem to channel the same energy as you. I always talk about Brene Brown, Rachel Hollis, Gwendolyn Doyle. Like, those are my people. Jen Hatmaker. They just scream the same exact energy that I do. And they're all in the same healing game as I am. So what I have Audible in my ears all the time. And that's really a good coping mechanism for me when I'm sitting in hard time, because hurt is going to happen. And triggers are going to happen. I think a lot of times, I love that Ana-Christina talks about it, is we think we do the hard work once and then we're done, right? And that's just not how it works. We have to set ourselves up for success and being able to recognize when triggers happen. Panic attacks. I went from having panic attacks once a week to once a year. So understanding that it's not a one and done, the same as forgiveness. Like, you don't forgive somebody, you're going to consistently have triggers of the feelings that you had from when you were taken advantage of. And each time that trigger happens, whether it be many times for victims of sexual assault or domestic violence, it might be cologne, or it might be the tone of somebody's voice. It's going to put you right back in that headspace. Okay, I have to dig in deep. I got to find out where my healthy coping mechanism is. Where's that weapon, right? I'm going to bust that out, and it's going to help me get through that process and get on with my day. And each time you do that, you build your power back, and it's such a rewarding feeling to be able to be like, I did this with my own 2 hands, with who I am. And the greatest thing I like to always hit on too is working with survivors. whether they are still in victimhood or not, is once they get to a place of I feel comfortable in my own skin again, I just remind them all I did was give you a mirror to your greatness again. I just reminded you who you were and gave you the tools for your toolkit to embrace healing, right? Not all people have had the opportunity for education when we're talking about resiliency or coping mechanisms or self-care, because they're all different in their own right, but they all are similar too. We all came from different backgrounds. So not every client that you have is going to be exactly the same. So when you are able just to say, here's your mirror, I just reminded you of your own greatness. Now go and flourish and, pass on the good stuff and do something similar to somebody else that's going through something similar than you. It's just the greatest feeling in the world. But again, we can't do any of that hard work without analyzing our internal constitution and where our foundation comes from. Otherwise, everything that we do internally and externally is going to be surface level tendencies. And I use that all the time when we're talking about that pretending, that shield. Like, I'm fine, you're fine, how are you? Every time we sit in Walmart, right? How are you? I'm great. Nobody cares. No one's asking because they generally want to know. That's surface level tendencies. I'm in the game, and I know Ana-Christina is in the game of digging deeper and really having that communication and conversation and relationship build with other humans. And the better we get at avoiding surface level tendencies, the greater the gift you give to yourself. So, yeah.
I love it. So could you dig in? So really it's this idea, I take notes like crazy. So the idea of really knowing what your constitution says. And really the second part is, does it need editing, right? That idea. And then you said some stuff, I don't know about anybody else on the call, but I didn't appreciate it very much, where, if you're vulnerable, you're going to get hurt. Well, you're just calling out the truth, right?
Yeah.
We don't like to think about that. But the truth is, if you're vulnerable, you're going to get hurt at some point, right? I've been behind in my life. I have been behind the 100-foot wall that was 100 foot thick with no walls and no walls, no windows and no doors. That's how I lived for a lot of years. And it's not a very cool existence. You think you're protected, but you keep everybody out. So that idea of vulnerability, what I really would like to know, right? The boots on the ground question, it's always about the powerful questions, is what would be one or two or three of your top questions that you've found to be effective? You mentioned it, but to be effective on how do we find out what our own internal constitution says? It seems like a simple statement that you make, and the way that the brain works, and I talk about it in Burnout Kryptonite, and the way that the brain works is when we ask a question, it moves to work on it. That's part of the internal work. When we ask surface level questions, we get surface level answers. When we ask those deeper questions, we get the deeper answers. So you mentioned a couple, like what do you like, what do you don't like, biases. And would you give us like your top 1 to 3 questions to help us to dive in as the helpers, to help our victims and our survivors when we have that relationship with them, to be able to perhaps ask some of these questions to help them get more clear?
Yeah, so obviously, especially when you're working with victims, you want to do the work of building rapport and getting to know that person first and foremost, right? You don't dive into the nitty-gritty right off the bat. You build the rapport first. But when they're working on their healing, and they're really just hitting brick walls left and right, top to bottom, that's when you really want to have that internal constitution conversation. And one of the main questions I ask individuals, but it was deep for myself, is what did the relationships that you had look like growing up? And what I mean by that, what role did your father fill? What role did your mother fill? What role did you fill? And going really from there, because like you said, the brain's going to expand from that specific question, because it's going to bring you to, well, did I even have a dad in the picture? Was my dad abusive? Did my mom have a submissive role in the relationship? Was mom a single mom that worked 4 jobs? It's just going to branch out to so many other questions, right? And it's usually that when you were a child household question that you can get a lot of answers in regards to why you think the way that you do. And it leads into the second question of your biases. We hear them every day, you know, men, women, persons of color, ethnicities, like there's biases all around us. The one thing I tell people is to challenge yourself to stop thinking you don't have them, because we all have them, because we all grew up as humans. It's recognizing what they are and if they're correct. You know, is there any truth to my bias that women should be a submissive role that stay in the household, right? I mean, that's a very logical one that a lot of people have. Okay, is there truth to that? Do I have research and studies to prove that I'm right or wrong? Or could I expand my knowledge on what women can do outside of the household, right? So again, it's just one specific question. What are my biases? i.e. based on gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation. I mean, you could ask so many questions. And then it's going to branch out to other stuff. And really, journaling is so important too when you're going through this process, to ensure that you're verbally maybe hearing yourself, but you're seeing the process that you're going through, because that's where true growth comes from, is sitting in that stuck and being truthful with yourself, and then being like, oh, okay, that doesn't make sense, right? And then the third, I would say, is how did I get where you are today, right? So unfortunately for many of us on this call, but also the victims that we work with, being a victim of some type of crime. What is my identifiers aside from victimhood? Because a lot of times we live in that identifier and we think that's our only identifier until we find another one. For some people, that's wife. For some people, that's husband. For some people, that's career, right? I drowned myself in my career. We feel that we have to give ourselves this other identifier before we can say, you know, I'm not a victim anymore. When it's going through that process of, yes, I was a victim of this is where I stand today, but my internal constitution speaks way more volumes. I have this characteristic, I have this skill set, is being able to own the trauma and take back control over it and stop adapting to these identifiers. We're such a society. I'm going to age myself and talk about like Twitter and Instagram, and I feel like that 80-year-old grandpa sometimes, and I'm like, back in my day, I used to walk in the snow uphill both ways to school. So sometimes I get on this soapbox and I feel like an 80-year-old man, but that's okay. But understanding there's so many identifier pushers out there when we're talking about even Instagram, trendsetters. Everybody wants to be a trendsetter on Instagram. Wow, you're embracing yourself and trying to give yourself this one identifier. That's a surface level tendency that has no substance to it. Really ask yourself, what is your skill sets and who you are and what you stand for. You're going to, again, branch off to a bunch of different answers that I can assure you is going to gain control and power back from that trauma, but you're not going to feel like you're just in this one little hole, because there's so much more to humans. That's just what I love about working with humans, is like, let me get to know all of you. I'm so fascinated.
I love it. I love it. So really kind of your 3 questions were kind of, what did my relationship look like growing up, right, in your household? And that kind of branches out. So, and then what biases do I have and how did I get where I am today? So how I'm looking at it too is I'm piling on questions. So let's see if I'm going in the right direction, right? I would ask questions to pile on to that, to say, okay, what did my relationship look like growing up, or relationships? What roles did I take on? What roles did I make judgments on? And understanding that we do make judgments. Judgment isn't necessarily a bad thing. It depends on what you do with the judgment. It's a whole different conversation. But just like, what judgment did I make? Women are this, men are this. I am this. What biases do I have? So that's a really, really powerful question. It's not asking, do I have any biases? It's asking, what biases do I have regarding what? And then you just start filling in the blank. What biases do I have regarding women? What biases do I have regarding men? What biases do I have regarding work? What biases do I have regarding having to stay busy? Right? What biases do I have and how do I judge myself? That would be these powerful questions that as you're asking those questions, your unconscious is running. And again, I talk about that in Burnout's Kryptonite, but your unconscious is running to fill in the blanks, right?
Yeah.
Those answers. How did I get where I am today? So what I really hear you talking about is not only how did I get where I am today, but really how have I been labeling myself?
Mm-hmm.
What labels have I put on myself? Right? You hear people that have stuff on them. I am this. I am is a label.
Yeah.
I am this. It's strong versus saying I have had trouble with this in the past, right?
Yeah.
Or I am a former blank, or I am a recovering blank. That's a different kind of label with a different kind of feeling, or I'm still learning. I'm still learning about this, and being careful what labels we identify with instead of saying I can't think of an exact one. I am working through the COVID in my life. Let me just throw that instead of my COVID diagnosis.
Mm.
So instead of taking on the diagnosis and saying my cancer, my COVID, my this, to say the COVID that has touched me, the diagnosis that has touched me. There's a different feeling there, and also it speaks to the unconscious mind in a different way. Are you grabbing on, glomming on, I am a victim, I was a victim, versus I am a survivor, or I am a thriver, or yeah, I had a hard time in my life at one point, and I have now been able to help people with that, right? We get to choose our label. So I think that idea of asking those really powerful questions is critical.
Yeah.
Critical.
And it just puts you in that mindset of power. Every time you're asking yourself these analytical conversation starters, like you said, it's going to spark something internally, and it gives you that power. It's understanding where you're at, who you are, and I don't need this identifier. And why in the world did I grasp this one identifier for so long, especially with domestic violence, right? When I spent so many years trying to be that perfect wife. And then I started asking those questions of like, what is a perfect wife? What does that look like? Because it's going to be completely different based on how you grew up, what your background was. And it's just a circle of power for me. I really think that when you ask yourself and you get to know who you are and how you're built on your own terms, not terms that were given to you. And that's where the internal constitution came from for me. And that's why I talk about it so much. And if it needs editing, because somebody else most likely wrote your internal constitution until you started asking these questions. So it's just really just giving yourself the power back.
I love it. I love it. So we're gonna go ahead and roll down we're gonna land the plane on the recording. And so I just want to thank you so much for being here, for sharing this idea of the Constitution, for sharing the idea of the vulnerability that's involved, right, in really getting that healing. And as we are helping other people, until and unless we heal first, it's hard for us to show up 100% for the other person. It's hard for us to show up congruently for the other person, regardless of what we think, it leaks out. So that idea, I really love that idea too. I just want to mention this, the idea of triggers. That triggers are the opportunity to use the home court advantage. What a reframe. What a reframe. To use that and say, wait, I have some tools to move past this trigger, and I have some tools to move into this trigger. And just because you're on the home court doesn't mean that it's easy. And you have more support and resources in general.
Yeah. For sure. A lot of times because we see the external, because it's something external that triggers a panic attack or anxiety attack, so on and so forth. And it's just reminding yourself, like, you got home court advantage. And yes, it's the ball player in me. I grew up playing basketball, but that's where I got it from. But yeah, you got home court advantage. Which of my coping mechanisms do I want to use for this one? For sure.
Absolutely. And asking those powerful questions, right? What is my role? What have I been thinking about the roles that were around me, the roles that I've played, the roles that I've stepped into that maybe somebody put that on me versus me choosing that role? What biases do I have? And the identifiers that I've carried, the labels that I've carried. So I want to thank you very much, Nichol, for being here. Thank you for sharing with us, and thank you for what you do. Thank you for what you do.
Thank you so much. Every time I get to talk to you is a blessing. So thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, here we go. So this is Ana-Christina sharing tools of hope with the Resilience Builders.